Ever since one caveman looked at another caveman and wondered how he could persuade him to share that animal he just killed, people have been doing psychology. But doing psychology is different from understanding psychology. And so in this video, we're going to look at our understanding of what psychology is through history. Now, for a long time, the people who primarily considered questions of human nature were theologians and philosophers. 17th century philosopher John Locke, for instance, made the claim that the newborn child is a tabula rasa, literally a blank tablet or blank slate, undefined by prior learning and ready to be written on and defined by their experience with the world. This is an early version of what we think of as the nature-nurture debate, where we wonder how much of human nature is innate and how much is environmental. It's a psychological question posed by a philosopher. Another 17th century philosopher, René Descartes, posed a more fundamental question. How is the mind connected to the body? Some people assume that Descartes came from a tradition of dualism, fundamental to many religious faiths, which assumes humans have both a physical form and a non-physical form. Within religion, this may be a spirit or a soul, but for Descartes it was the mind. Again, though, this is a philosopher asking a psychological question. How does human conscious experience arise from biological mechanisms? So for centuries, philosophers asked these questions, but they never gathered data. That's one of the things that helps differentiate a psychologist from a philosopher, as the latter tend to think a lot about the implications of their ideas, but they don't necessarily test them empirically. Philosophers are an important part of the history of psychology, but most people consider them separate from the field of psychology. The formal history of psychology really starts in the 1800s, when people like Wilhelm Wundt, Edward Bradford Titchener, and William James opened the early labs for the study of psychology as a science. Now, truth be told, what they called science wouldn't necessarily pass muster by today's standards. Wundt's approach, called structuralism, often relied on a method called trained introspection, within which a person examined their own internal experiences in a formal way in order to identify the structures of the mind. Interesting, but also very subjective. William James' approach of functionalism, derived from evolutionary theory, asked what the survival function was for different aspects of human behavior and the mind. Again, it asked interesting questions, but often explored the scientific implications via thought rather than by gathering of data. So for some time, these were the two dominant approaches to psychology as a science. Meanwhile, around the same period, the most famous psychologist in modern history, Sigmund Freud, was developing his own ideas about personality, development, and psychological disorders from his practice of psychoanalysis, a form of psychotherapy. He built his model based on his observations of and interactions with his patients. He didn't formally gather data, though, so his model has often been viewed as unscientific. Still, as we move into the 20th century, Freud's model gained traction and public attention. In the 1920s, Freud's model became widely known thanks in part to booming economies in Western Europe and the United States, which gave people disposable income to spend on Freudian psychoanalysis. His model influenced many works of literature and film of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So, Freud became the public face of psychotherapy. Meanwhile, some other psychologists were working to make psychology more scientific. Scientists such as Ivan Pavlov, John Watson, and B.F. Skinner took the approach that since formal science requires observation and measurement of data, the science of psychology should study only those things that are observable and measurable. We cannot see internal mental states, only external behavior. So they declared that the science of psychology should be the study of observable human behavior, and thus was born the field of behaviorism. behaviorism quickly became the dominant approach to the science of psychology. And overall, the field was mostly divided between behaviorism as its science and the Freudian approach for the practice of psychology in psychotherapy. This division dominated psychology through the 1930s and into the 1940s. But the post-war period would bring dramatic shifts in the field, and we'll pick up with those in the next video. Psychology. The word Gestalt roughly translates as whole, and their approach was to study human perception and experience as a whole rather than trying to break it down into component parts as the structuralists had done. So for example, in this image you probably perceive a white upside-down triangle. No triangle is fully drawn, yet we assemble the various clues to perceive a meaningful whole. This is the kind of thing that interested the Gestalt psychologists. However, many of these psychologists faced a serious problem. Some were of Jewish descent or faith, in a culture where Adolf Hitler ultimately would come to marginalize and order the systemic murder of German Jews. Others were not themselves Jewish, but objected to Hitler's treatment of their Jewish colleagues and friends. As Hitler's regime turned its population against these people, several Gestalt psychologists left Germany and sought exile in the United States. Max Wertheimer came to work at the New School for Social Research, Kurt Kafka at Smith College, and Wolfgang Köhler at Swarthmore College. So, jumping back to the 1950s, a young psychology student by the name of Ulrich Neisser took up graduate study at Swarthmore. Studying under Köhler and his assistant Hans Wallach, another émigré from Nazi Germany, Neisser came to decide that internal mental states could be studied using scientific methods, an approach he would come to advocate as the field of cognitive psychology. Over time, cognitive psychology would come to supplement behaviorism as a dominant approach to scientific psychology. As the science of psychology was undergoing a challenge to its dominant behaviorist model, so too was the case with the practice of psychology. Some psychologists had become dissatisfied with Freudian psychology as the dominant approach to psychotherapy, declaring it to be too dark and judgmental about human nature. They preferred a model that was more optimistic, an approach that looked more at people's potential in the future than at their failings of the past. These humanistic psychologists, people like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, were the first real challengers to the Freudian model, and over time their approach to the client within therapy came to displace Freudianism from its dominance of the practice of psychology. As we get into the 1960s, we see further important developments. Feminist psychologists, such as Carol Gilligan, would make the valid criticism that the field was too dominated by men and a masculine perspective, and they would work to introduce a broader, more inclusive approach. Sociocultural psychologists would point out that too much of the research in psychology studied only Western populations, and would advocate for an approach that was more culturally inclusive. The field has not always acted on their perspectives. Too much research continues to be conducted only on Western college students, but they made important points that resonate to this day. However, the most major shift in the field of psychology came in the 1970s and 80s, with the development of new technology that would allow us to observe the structure and activity of the living human brain. Prior to this period, if you wanted to connect brain and behavior, to try to solve Descartes' mind-body problem, you mostly had to find people who were abnormal, wait for them to die, and then cut up their brain to see how it was different. However, with the invention of these new tools, we could now look at the brain structure or brain activity of people while they were still alive, and we could have them engage in behaviors within brain scanners to see how these affected brain activity. This field of neuroscience grew during the last 35 years into a dominant approach within psychology. Some would argue too dominant. The tools, for all their sophistication, remain relatively coarse in terms of what they can tell us about human nature at the level of the brain, and many works of popular neuroscience tend to overstate the extent to which narrowly structured neuroscience studies can be generalized to sophisticated human behaviors. Nonetheless, this is a fundamental part of where the field is right now and where it will be headed in the future. So where does that leave us? Ultimately, psychology is different things to different people. The research world has cognitive psychologists, behaviorists, neuroscientists, and many others. The world of practice includes a variety of perspectives, from people still influenced by Freud to humanists and practitioners of cognitive and behavioral methods. The field has come a long way, and yet it remains a very young science. We still cannot answer fundamental questions like the mind-body problem, but every day thousands of people around the world are working to advance our understanding of the field of psychology.